Good evening and welcome to the Ford Presidential Library. My name is Joel Westfall, and it is my absolute honor to serve here as the Deputy Director of both the museum and the library. In case you're wondering, our esteemed leader, Dr. Didier, home sporting a very, very spiffy walking cast and cannot be here tonight. But we are very pleased to have you with us tonight for what is our last program of our 2018 series. And I also welcome you on behalf of the Archivist of the United States. We are also very grateful of members of Friends of Ford and contributors to the Foundation for providing your support. The Ford Foundation provides support for programs like these, our research grants, public programs. The Foundation plays an important role in promoting the ideals, values, and commitment to public service, and by fostering increased awareness of the historical legacy of President Ford. It is through the generosity of the Foundation that we offer these scholarly and relevant programs at both the library and the museum. And so we're going to change things up just a little bit tonight. Normally the director or the deputy would introduce our guest, but because this is a very special program with a very special award from the Ford Foundation, I am very, 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 very happy to introduce Joe Calvaruso, Executive Director of the Ford Foundation. Joe, it's all yours.
Thanks, Joel. It's great to come over in Ann Arbor on a beautiful fall winter day and be able to look forward to that short drive back, but the weather's great. So thanks everybody for coming out here in this soon-to-be holiday season here. You know, each year the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation awards two distinguished journalist awards, one for the presidency and one for the national defense. 31 years ago in 1988, President Ford wanted to recognize and encourage thoughtful, insightful journalist work that takes place in this country. And you know, when I reflected back on that, when he stepped into office, he came in and he says, I'm going to be transparent to people. And soon to be in Grand Rapids, and then right after that in April is going to be David Kennerly, the White House photographer, which was almost given unlimited access, which is the prior administration would have never thought possible or would have even considered. We have a long-standing list of distinguished winners. In particular, they have worked for organizations like the Washington Post, USA Today, CBS News, and many more. Tonight, we welcome National Security Correspondent J.J. Green, winner of the 2017 Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prize for Distinguished Reporting on National Defense. You know, for the very first time, the judging panel recognized radio journalism, and we are delighted that J.J. was the winner. He regularly provides on-air analysis, guidance on global security issues at WTOP. WTOP. Okay, you have to have me on the show and I'll get that better for you next time. One of the three all-new stations in Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. JJ hosts the weekly program The Hunt and conducts in-depth interviews with experts on ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and other terrorist groups. He worked extensively in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Africa in 2006 during the height of the Iraq War and logged 18,000 miles, 10 countries, in 31 days. Covering the wars in Iraq, Africa, and Afghanistan, he's the recipient of over 24 national, regional, and local awards for his broadcasting effort. We look forward to hearing J.J. talk tonight on national security in threatening times. Before we get started, I'd like to take and read a couple excerpts, and we were talking about that earlier, that the Journalism Prize judges, and it's totally independent. In fact, I resist even looking at them before we send them to the judges. That way nobody can ask me any questions. I have no ideas what they are. We make copies, we bundle them up, and we send them to non-related foundation people that have backgrounds in journalism. Some have wrote speeches for former presidents and that type of a background. In the judge's view, and this is, I'm quoting, J.J.'s Green Series addressed one of the most critical national security issues of the year and for the future, Russian cyber attacks against American election infrastructure, at a time in which the debate over this threat to the country often results in bipartisan wrangling. Mr. Green stayed rigorously apolitical, and that is something I really admire in his work, and the judges did as well. He covered tactics, targets, methods of cyber attack in the United States, and engaged a wide range of national experts and leaders in the series. Each segment contained an example that made the risk relatable to us. Mr. Green managed to condense all this information in 2-minute segments that were cohesive, informational, understandable, and interesting. He truly met the Foundation's overarching goals of fostering better public understanding of the nation's security. At the same time, Mr. Green leveraged the narrative power of the media, radio, to give color to hard-hitting coverage of an issue with local and national and global impact. End of quote. JJ and his radio station put together this short clip that we actually played at the Foundation's board meeting in Washington this year, and I'd like to show it here. If we can take a minute, go ahead and play this.
It's November 15th, 2016, 1 week after the U.S. election. I'm at a NATO conference in Sofia, Bulgaria. The place has been buzzing about Russian interference in the U.S. election. One intelligence source has told me there are no less than 140 English-language fake news outlets in neighboring Macedonia, all for the purpose of manipulating voters' thinking in the U.S. Back in Washington, March 30th, 2017, former FBI Special Agent Clint Watts had noticed similar activity, and he told the Senate Intelligence Committee he believed those websites were linked to bots.
A closer look at those bots tied in closely with other social media campaigns we had observed pushing Russian propaganda months before.
U.S. intelligence believed it was all a part of a sophisticated Russian intelligence operation.
They have an extremely capable intelligence service with exceptional cyber capabilities that they have repeatedly demonstrated not only against the United States but against places like Estonia and Georgia.
Robert Glitt was general counsel in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence until earlier this year. Former House Intelligence Committee Chairman Mike Rogers said this was a part of an overarching doctrine in Russia.
And so they took all of their cyber actors and are combining them in this one information warfare center.
In an exclusive interview, Virginia Senator Mark Warner, Vice Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, explained how Russia went about its work.
Specifically what Russia did, they started a campaign where they hacked into private individual accounts, both parties' accounts, Democrats and Republicans.
That was only a small part of what the U.S. intelligence community believed was a massive, sophisticated Russian operation that extended back years, designed to interfere in the U.S. social, political, and cultural systems with the objective of sowing seeds of chaos. On Capitol Hill, J.J. Green, WTOP News.
Ladies and gentlemen, J.J. Green, welcome to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe. Good evening. And a very sincere thank you to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation and its leadership and the team here at the library for its invitation to speak here tonight. I know you have a couple of questions, so I'm going to get one of them out of the way right now. JJ stands for Jesse James. All right? And it's not the Jesse James you're thinking of. Jesse James was my father's first two names. He passed away last year. I'm a junior. James was my grandmother's maiden name. So we have my grandmother's maiden name as our middle name. But that doesn't mean I haven't engaged in some clandestine activity. It was all innocent, though, as time has passed. But anyway, the other questions I'll answer later, hopefully, if you'll allow me to continue this evening. I would like to offer special thanks to the judges in the journalism competition who thought enough of my work to recognize it for the 31st Gerald R. Ford Journalism Prize for reporting on national defense. There are many other journalists who undoubtedly deserves it, but I'll be eternally grateful that they chose me. And I'm also mindful, as Joe mentioned, that this is the first time that a radio journalist has received the award, and I can guarantee you, as a lifelong practitioner of radio news, it was a sweet moment of recognition for all of us in radio, and I've heard that from our colleagues as well. This award, one of two, as you know, which were initiated in 1988, is designed to foster better public understanding of national defense. Another objective is to recognize and encourage thoughtful, insightful, enterprising work. And for my entire career, which coincidentally started the very same year this award was handed out for the first time, 1988, those high ideals have always been among my personal journalistic guiding principles. And for my career, I've often looked back with regret on a few things. So tonight I'm going to confess three of my regrets. The first one was turning down the Defense Intelligence Agency when it came calling more than 10 years ago. Number two was turning down DNI Admiral Mike McConnell when he asked me to join the intelligence community in 2007. There are days as I've traveled around the world and the country covering the intelligence community and the men and women who so adequately and wonderfully, I should say, make up the backbone of our nation's safety and security system, that I've often thought maybe I missed my calling. Maybe I should have done that. But grinding it out all these years in the trenches of journalism resulted in a great reward this year from the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, and I will never forget that or the fact that I'm able to speak to you tonight, right here. So, my third regret, it came during one of the biggest speeches of my life in 2012. I was delivering the commencement address at the University of Maryland, University College. And after what I thought was a rousing, motivating, and just amazing speech that had almost 5,000 people smiling and cheering and laughing and feeling good, I realized the next day when I went back and looked at the videotape, dressed in my cap and gown, the little tassel that streamed down from my cap was stuck in my beard. So from my vantage point, that explained why everybody was laughing and smiling the whole time. The regret was not making a final check before I took to the podium. So tonight, Mr. Westfall and Ms. Murray took me back to the presidential restroom area, and I made that final check, and I'm not going to make that mistake tonight. I've shaved off the beard, and I'm counting on you to stand up and say something. If something is out of place, if there's some salad stuck in my teeth, or if something looks kind of weird up here. Anyway, my topic tonight is national security in threatening times. In order to address this topic, I'd like to talk to you for a few moments about the times we live in. But before I do that, I want to say that I'm a journalist, and I want you to be sure that what I'm saying is based on research and not my opinion. Not long ago, a journalist was killed and chopped into little pieces by Saudi intelligence operatives. And according to intelligence from the CIA and others, it was done at the behest of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Recently, the Russian Navy hijacked and stole 3 ships from Ukraine's Navy 4 years after taking away a part of that country. Just yesterday, we learned that Russia has now deployed 2 nuclear-capable bombers in Venezuela, a very clear signal to U.S. intelligence law enforcement, military, and the government in general as tensions between Russia and the U.S. continue to escalate. A famine in Yemen, which is playing out in the midst of a brutal civil war, is claiming hundreds of lives every day. Chinese intelligence has secretly infested millions of American computers with devices and software that secretly track every user's move and keystrokes. According to cyber experts, 1 in every 131 emails has malware in it. North Korea has developed a nuclear-capable missile that's capable of reaching the whole of the United States. A father and daughter were poisoned in the UK in March by a team of Russian assassins. They survived, but a homeless woman who was given what appeared to be a bottle of perfume her partner found died because she sprayed a little bit of the contents of that bottle on her wrists, like most women would do when they get a bottle of perfume, and she was killed by a deadly poison that was produced, packaged, and put in the hands of killers dispatched by Russian intelligence. The government in Syria has killed hundreds of thousands of its own citizens using an assortment of weapons, including lethal chemicals, and the Assad regime is continuing its deadly reign of terror. We've seen a stunning rise across the globe in racism and anti-Semitism. Gigantic wildfires, multiple 1,000-year floods, record-breaking cold, devastating tornadoes, hurricanes, typhoons, earthquakes, tsunamis. Regardless of what your view of climate change is, it's clear something is happening with the climate. Hundreds of millions of people have had their identities exposed on the dark web because of breaches in security by major corporations all over the world. And perhaps the most disturbing to some, the US president is deeply involved in an investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election conducted by a special counsel authorized by the US Justice Department. I mention all these tragic, sad, and worrisome developments because they frame the times that we live in. They don't define it, but they do frame it. This is not to suggest that the world has never been in this predicament before, not to minimize the tragedies that we've seen taking place recently. There have been many far more tragic, sad, and worrisome developments throughout history. A few examples: World War I, 37 million people died, many of them teenagers. 4.5% of the entire population of the country of France was erased in that war. World War II, 80 million people died. Many people died in Nazi death camps. 1931, an estimated 4 million people died in a flood in China. 1976, the Tangshan earthquake, 650,000 people died in that. 1918, a flu pandemic. 1 million people died in this country. So I think you get the picture there. But the key reason why I laid out all these unfortunate incidents and situations and drew the comparison is to highlight how the times we live in are impacted by one single phenomenon, which may be the biggest current threat to U.S. national security of all. Several years ago, during an interview with General Ron Burgess, the head of DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, he said to me, one of the greatest threats to the U.S. national security right now is the pace of change. He was referring to the theory called Moore's Law. In 1965, Gordon Moore, co-founder of Intel, predicted that the computing power of the world would double every couple of years. And since that time, the process has continued. And now, essentially, the cost of powerful, fast electronic devices has become so affordable that even the poorest among us can afford them and access to the networks and platforms that come with these devices. This is a really good thing because people can afford them. But the bottom line on this is that we're in an era where information is fire hosing at us at a pace that we, the consumers of this technology, can barely keep up with. What does that mean for national security? Two critical elements. The amount of information, emails, text, phone calls, and social media posts grows exponentially every couple of months. Not years, but months. That's because of these new platforms and these new devices that are coming out are getting so good at pumping out information. It's pushing more and more on us, and we're trying to consume it all, and that's why you see people at the bus stop, or certainly here in this college town, kids walking down the street like this. And so while I have your attention for a moment, I'd like everyone who can to stand up. You can sit back down now. That's a little trick I learned a few years ago because I know I have a monotonous voice and I put people to sleep. I also learned from 60 Minutes not too long ago that the average amount of time that people can stay away from looking at their smartphones is 19 and a half minutes. So I figured I'd cut that in half and maybe go back to it a little bit later, but also I can change my inflection a little bit and let you know that I am not a robot. So, two critical elements. The amount of information, text, and all that stuff I just told you about, that means that we're really just struggling to keep up with all that information, fire hosing at us. In other words, we have more emails, text, and phone calls and social media posts than we can decide how to respond to. That means more and more time is required to go through all these messages and figure out what to do with them. And that can cause us to be distracted, like those people walking like this. People have been hit by cars. They walked off of cliffs. They walked into each other. They walked into utility poles. There have been all sorts of unfortunate accidents that have taken place because of the need to try to respond to all of this information that's being pushed at us through this technology, which is great, but you got to know how to handle it. But the second reason is at the heart of why the pace of change is affecting U.S. national security. Not all of the consumers of this technology are good, well-intentioned people. There are bad actors out there who are using the same technology that we are to hurt us. Terrorists, cyber criminals, even petty criminals. They're all in the game. They've got the Signal and they've got the WhatsApp and the Snapchat and Skype and all of these communications tools that we have on our phones and the productivity tools that we have on our smartphones and tablets and laptops and computers. They have that too. And they're using it to literally kill us. There's a situation that's developed in this nation that we need to, in my opinion, be aware of. There was a time when we could rely on the military and the intelligence community and law enforcement to protect us from foreign threats. And that's not to say they're not doing that now, because they're doing a hell of a job against all odds, considering what we're up against now. But it's possible now, because of technology, for these foreign threats to reach right around them, reach right around the military, right around the intelligence community, right directly into your pocket. Through your phone, through technology, they can rob us blind without us even knowing about it. So this is the reason why what General Burgess was saying, the pace of change is the biggest threat to us. And this is but one element of a dark federation of conspirators some witting and some without their knowledge, that are complicating U.S. national security. There is another category, and this is going to get me to the heart of what I'm here to do tonight. It's nation states. In his 2018 Worldwide Threat Assessment, Director of National Intelligence Dan Coates said Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea will pose the greatest cyber threat to the United States during the next year. He said, these states are using cyber operations as a low-cost tool of statecraft, and we assess that they will use cyber operations to achieve strategic objectives unless they face clear repercussions for their cyber operations. Non-state actors will continue to use cyber operations, he said, for financial crime and to enable propaganda and messaging. He went on to say, the use of cyber attacks as a foreign policy tool outside of military conflict has been mostly limited to sporadic lower-level attacks. But Russia, Iran, North Korea, he said, however, are testing more aggressive cyber attacks that pose growing threats to the U.S. and its partners. In addition, Coates and other U.S. intelligence figures have agreed. The U.S. is facing a complex global foreign threat, frankly, that we haven't seen before. They assess that the leading state intelligence threats to the U.S. will come and are coming from Russia and China, based on their intelligence services, capabilities, intent, and their broad operational scopes. Other states in the Near East, South Asia, East Asia, Latin America will also pose local and regional intelligence threats to U.S. interests. For example, Russia and Cuban intelligence and security services continue to view the U.S. as a primary threat. And I want to ask you if you've heard about something recently, and that's a story about U.S. diplomats in Cuba being sick. So I spoke to a couple of sources about what that could possibly be. And that source, who happened to work in Russia back in the 80s, said it reminds me of something that happened to U.S. diplomats in Russia back in the 80s. It's a situation where a microwave was used, essentially to harm them. Bottom line, what's going on in Cuba, what's going on in Venezuela with these Russian bombers being stationed there, what's going on in North Korea, they're not things that are just happening in a vacuum. They're happening based on the information that I've gotten from sources that I've spoken to. They're happening because they're being enabled by one of the U.S.'s biggest adversaries, and some would argue enemy at this point, and that would be Russia. As I mentioned, the Kremlin, to be more precise, is leading the pack when it comes to targeting the U.S. During the research for the series that Joe mentioned to you tonight, Anatomy of a Russian Attack, I found something that startled me. I realized they began laying the groundwork for the attack that we finally caught on to in 2016. They began laying the groundwork for that attack back in the 1990s. In the geopolitical haze that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, the surviving Russian government promptly launched attempts to undermine the U.S. government from the inside out. This is according to sources who have detailed knowledge of Russia's plans and operations. So I want you to check this out very carefully. According to a top U.S. counterintelligence official, the U.S. State Department itself gave Russian agents arguably the best opportunity to execute an attack on U.S. soil. Robert Booth said to me, and I'll tell you who he is in just a moment, in 1991 and 1992, senior members of the State Department felt as though Russia was gone, the old Russia, and there was a new Russia emerging. He said they felt, quote, they were friends. We can work with them. That mentality literally opened the door to a series of U.S. government mistakes, said Booth. And Booth is a former director of counterintelligence at the State Department's Bureau of Diplomatic Security. He said, unfortunately, that led to the decision that Russian diplomats who visited the State Department would be allowed to walk unescorted in Foggy Bottom every time they visited Foggy Bottom, alone. Counterintelligence authorities, and this is Booth and his people, tried to warn State Department officials. Booth said, my office and the FBI were aware of what was going on. So we had an operation, he said, where we actually monitored the Russian diplomats that we'd seen walking outside of the State Department. And we tried to alert our senior membership about the situation. And he said, we were rebuffed. Then, all of a sudden, Booth's team noticed, his team and the FBI noticed that the Russian diplomats' visits to the State Department had stopped suddenly. But the damage was already done. It became clear to us later on, he said, that the operation they had run was over with. Booth said they had successfully introduced, and you may remember this, a listening device in a conference room on the 7th floor of the State Department's headquarters. The device was discovered in 1999, 8 years after Booth and diplomatic security and the FBI had warned that something was not quite right about these people that were sort of walking around in the State Department. Taking advantage of U.S. naivete, Russian diplomats and ostensibly intelligence operatives were able to roam around in the State Department in the early 1990s. They were taking notes and collecting intelligence. Some experts believe they made friends who would assist them later on in pulling off the most stunning intelligence feat of the time in the U.S. The KGB was able to install a listening device in a conference room outside, just outside of the Secretary of State's office. It was concealed inside of a piece of chair molding. Russians, according to Booth, attended bilateral and trilateral meetings with their American counterparts in that room. Obviously, Booth said, one or two of the Russian diplomats were intelligence officers under diplomatic cover. They were able to get a picture and determine the exact color and specification of the chair molding. It went back to Moscow. Moscow duplicated it and put a listening device with batteries in it inside and sent it back to Washington. The most troubling part of the story was that it came back to Washington. According to Booth, the agents were able to come back into the conference room, remove the original chair rail molding, and substitute the fake one with the listening device without anybody knowing. That swap still bedevils many in the intelligence community. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you tonight that 21 years after that happened, it's still unsolved. The case is still unsolved. Booth told me on August 14th, 2 years ago, there was a great debate. There's simply no question that the Russians had unimpeded access to the room on at least 2 to 3 occasions, but they had been alone in there. And the fact that Russian diplomats were allowed to move around unescorted in the State Department possibly solves the question of how they were able to do that. But for Booth and others, that doesn't mean that they did it themselves. Some suspected they had help. 50% of those queried in the intelligence community believe that that may be the case. A high-level U.S. intelligence source with deep knowledge of Russian spycraft agrees with Booth. That source has told me, I believe the Russians used an auxiliary asset to replace the piece of authentic chair rail molding with one containing a bug. A cleaning lady or man could easily have done it. A good motivation, according to the source, is $50,000. The source, who spent decades in Russia, and hear me now on this, in close proximity to the KGB, told me, I'm sure this was the case. The Russians didn't do it themselves. It would have been an unjustified suicidal mission. The source even detailed the likely steps that were used to install it. 1, take a good quality photo and measurements. Step 2, make two almost invisible incisions with the tool provided by the KGB handler. Take the old piece out, step 3, and put the new one in. Each step takes no more than 2 minutes, according to the source. With minimal training and reasonable precautions, it would have been a piece of cake, said the source. It's not clear, I need to remind you, how long that listening device was in place, because it was 8 years after this unescorted activity began that this bug was discovered. As for the tactics, this is a critical part of why I'm here tonight, to share with you this part of the story and to make absolutely clear that you get it. As for the tactics the Russians used and how they created the climate for the 2016 election meddling operation, Dr. Christopher Paul, a senior social scientist at the Rand Corps, told me, when you think about Russia, you have to think that this is a nation of chess players. And there are 2 aspects to chess. One is thinking tens, if not dozens of moves ahead and planning meticulously how things unfold. Bottom line is, those dozens, tens or dozens of moves in terms of a chess game, when you take it and hold it up against the backdrop of this operation, translates into years of preparation, laying the groundwork for what they wanted to do in 2016. On the night of the election, 2016, a politician in Russia by the name of Vladimir Zhirinovsky had a champagne party. And in that party, he held up a glass of champagne and said to the Russian Federation and to Mother Russia, congratulations on achieving something that we've been trying to achieve for 70 years. I'm not going to say or try to put words in his mouth as to what he meant or to translate what he meant, but what he said seems to speak volumes. Russia had been trying to attack the U.S. for many, many years, and he viewed that situation that night as essentially the culmination of an attack. And I'm again reminding you, I'm a journalist. I'm not saying this because I believe one way or the other, but this is what the research says. When our current president was elected, Zhirinovsky claimed it as a victory for Mother Russia. Why? Again, I don't know for sure, but it seemed to speak volumes about what he believes Russian intelligence was trying to achieve. I happened to speak with Ambassador Melvin Levitsky today, who is one of your distinguished local professors who actually spent some time in Russia, and he said to me, you have to take with a grain of salt stuff that Zhirinovsky says. So that's what we're going to do. But I'm just going to point out to you that he did say it. And he did seem to be very clear that it was necessary to celebrate that night and to use those words. So what I'm saying to you is what took place in the years leading up to that was some meticulous groundwork being laid for something we would see much later on. The other opportunity, the other thing about the chess game is that the opportunity that it poses, a game between 2 people means that if your opponent makes a mistake, you can exploit that. And that seems to be what they did. Allowing Russian agents to meander freely inside the State Department may have been the break the KGB sought to begin setting the stage for something that they would hopefully be able to achieve that they knew they couldn't achieve at the time. And it seems as though that's exactly what took place, as these facts that we're now learning from the Justice Department and from the special prosecutor about Russian activity around that time seems to bear out. One of my most valuable sources of understanding when it came to Russian intelligence was a defector named Sergei Tretyakov. He unfortunately died several years ago, and unfortunately at the young age of 54 in 2010. He said to me unequivocally, the Cold War never ended, and he said there are many, many warning signs and a lot of evidence that bear that out. From a national security perspective, based on my reporting and the people that I've had many lengthy conversations with in the U.S., we're in a tight spot right now for several reasons. One, the international chaos triggered by the Kremlin's interference in our politics. Two, Russia's next game has been underway already for years. We didn't know about it. We may not know about what's going on now. I will say this. I have a whole lot more faith in our intelligence community to know things than I have in me as a journalist to find them out. But we may not know the extent of what they're engaging in their next game is. As Dr. Paul said, the Kremlin's plan to attack the country started a long time ago. And as other sources have said, what they were doing was missed by naive Americans or simply dismissed. This year I've worked on 2 projects that have made very clear to me that the Kremlin has dumped a lot of thought and resources into targeting the U.S. One was a series called The Tale of the Troll. I was able to track down one of the internet trolls that worked at Russia's famous internet research agency. And we were able to peel back the layers and reveal the inner workings of this troll house in St. Petersburg that was aimed at tricking Americans using various social media platforms as a part of a Kremlin disinformation campaign leading up to the 2016 election. His name was Marat Mindyarov. He wandered into 55 Sovershkina Street, St. Petersburg, for 3 distinct but connected reasons. First of all, he said, I was unemployed. Secondly, he said, it was next to my house. The third thing he said, I was curious about what was going on inside. So he applied for a job. He was hired for a brief but very eye-opening experience, and then he quit. And then he began alerting his friends about what he learned. In an extensive interview, Marat detailed what he called the Orwellian activities that went on inside that building. The U.S. Justice Department called it the Internet Research Agency, and that's essentially the name of it. It's believed to be the hub of a Kremlin-sponsored troll operation designed to interfere in U.S. politics. The factory, as Marat described it, employed more than 600 people. It was a 4-story building with 10 rooms on each floor. In each room, there were about 20 people writing. He was employed to be one of those writers. He said, I was hired to make the comments on the Russian political scene. He worked the day shift, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. That was one of 2 12-hour shifts at the factory each day. The work, he said, was grueling because the requirements were so high, he said, there was no walking around. Everyone sat in front of their computers writing and writing and writing. There were no jokes, he said, no music, no social stuff, just work, work, work. No fun at all, he said. Each day, he said, started with an assignment. And here's the curious thing. In the morning, he said, you got an email with lots of links to internet sites where people were supposed to post comments. These were internet sites that are very, very familiar and frequented by Americans. He said they told you the topics you should comment on and how to write your comments. You just had to play with the words. He said he became quickly disenfranchised and disenchanted. The job was monotonous. There was no creativity in it. It was mechanical writing because nobody cared about his opinion and his thoughts. He said you just had to follow the line. You had to write what you were told to write. Soon he realized the robot-like operation was driven by a sinister motive. He realized that it was designed to promote lies. He said, when you're writing that white is black and black is white, it's the same as what George Orwell wrote in his novel, 1984. It was the same feeling for me, he said. Something very strange and surrealistic was going on. 2 years later, in January of 2016, the U.S. intelligence community released a damning assessment that confirmed everything he said. It supported the claim that the Russian government had been running parts of a disinformation campaign at that very facility. We assess with high confidence that Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered the intelligence campaign in 2016 aimed at the U.S. presidential election. This is according to an assessment from the Director of National Intelligence. It went on to say this influence campaign was aimed at the presidential election, and it consisted of goals which were to undermine public faith in the U.S. democratic process and to denigrate Senator Hillary Clinton and to harm her eligibility, or rather her electability and potential presidency. Marat confirmed for me that that indeed was the case. He found out because he wanted a better job. The job that he had was paying him 45,000 rubles a month, which is about $800. So in order to get a better job, he found out that there was an opportunity to work for a different part of this troll factory. So instead of writing for the Russian audience, he wanted to write for the American audience. They had a group called the Facebook group. So he had to take a test in order to be eligible to move up to this Facebook unit. He flunked the test. He said, maybe I flunked the test because my English wasn't that good. But the more damning and telling reason, on the test, he was asked what his opinion of Hillary Clinton was. And he said, I think it would be cool if she would be president of the United States. Immediately, he was essentially sent back, never given another opportunity, and it became clear to him after some conversations with some of his friends that Hillary Clinton was the second target of this whole operation. I need to tell you just how potent this operation in this building was, this place was. And I probably need to start wrapping this thing up very shortly here because I want to take some questions from you. In 2014, on September 11th, early in the morning in St. Mary Parish in Louisiana, the Homeland Security Department started getting phone calls from citizens who had gotten text messages on their phones saying that there was a chemical plant explosion in their neighborhood. They were overwhelmed with the calls. If you go back and look at what took place that day, there were people who were getting these text messages. On that day, as a member of the press, I can recall that we heard that this crazy thing had taken place. There was a YouTube video that had been posted showing this chemical plant burning. There was a CNN headline that essentially showed this thing unfolding, this Columbia chemical plant on fire. And so for 2 hours, the entire media, coast to coast, was locked into this. And we discovered after about 2 hours that it was all a big lie. Everybody, I want you to know that this troll factory was responsible for every letter of it. They even produced the video of a guy sitting there watching a TV with a headline on it that said ISIS was responsible for this attack. This was a part of their test to see where we were, to see if we were paying attention, and we weren't. So as I wrap this talk up this evening, I want to ask you a question, and then I'm hopeful that you'll ask me some questions. When you think about all the things and the incidents that I've told you about so far this evening, when you think about all the places in the world where you see things taking place and see things happening, when you think about what you know and what you are certain of when it comes to what you know about all of these things, how much of it can you really believe is true? How much of it are you comfortable with this knowledge that you have about? In other words, of all the things that you're hearing, are you okay with what you're hearing? Are you okay with what you're seeing? Are you okay with the people that are telling you these things? Do you have suspicions about the information, about what's being done with it? Are you okay with what we as a nation are doing, where we are as a nation? How do you feel? This is more than one question, I guess. I got a lot of questions too. So how do you feel about U.S. national security? How do you feel about where we are now as opposed to where we were 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago? And how do you feel about where we're going? Because I got a little bit of insight into where I think we're going. Every clock with a pendulum usually experiences this rocking mechanism of the pendulum. It goes back and forth and back and forth until the power source is cut. And for those clocks that don't have a power source, well, they'll stop when they break. Are we at the point now where we've gotten to the point where we can no longer do the things that make us one as a nation? Are we at the point where we don't realize that national security is local security? And local security is each and every one of us. What we think, what we do, what we believe, how we act, where we go. Our economy is a part of our national security. And I know here with the GM news recently, I know that's a big concern for people. But the bottom line on what I'm talking to you tonight about, national security in threatening times starts with each one of us. Our ability to deal with the fire hose of information that we're seeing, figuring out what it is that we can believe, figuring out what we're going to do with that information, and then getting up and going and doing something with it. My job as a journalist is not to take a side. It's not to favor a political party or an issue, but it's simply to find the facts, analyze them, figure out whether it's true or not, and bring them to you. As a surrogate for the public, I can honestly say to you, we are in threatening times, and our national security has a problem with all of the many threats that I've told you about, but I do feel confident that we will be okay. The question is how long it's going to take us to get there, because we're in a bit of a pickle right now. So to that question that I was going to ask you, are you okay with where we are? That's what I'll ask you. I'll leave that with you to ruminate. And if that triggers any kind of response, I'd love to hear about it. And if you have questions, I definitely want to hear about those. So thank you very much for tolerating me. And I'll ask you if you don't mind, if you have a question, there's a microphone in the back of the room. Please use the microphone for those of us who may not be able to hear very well. But I'd love to hear your question. Would you just introduce yourself?
Good evening. James Piazza is my name. And the question I'd like to ask you, sir, after that excellent explanation, somewhat frightening. Recently I was watching a television program. A gentleman by the last name of Pillsbury wrote a book called The 100-Year Marathon that reflects on the activities that you just described similarly in China. I'm curious if you can share any insights into that book.
On the book?
Or what he had to say about that.
Well, now I have to admit that you've put me on the spot because I haven't read the book. But would you like to familiarize me with the story?
As well as I can, I'd be happy to.
I've read 7 books this year. Some of them I've read a couple of times. I'm not kidding, but I'm not familiar with, I haven't read that one.
I would also offer the Piazza seal of approval in terms of recommending this book. If you buy it and read it and don't like it, I will give you your money back.
Tell me what it's about.
The synopsis, as I best understand it, is a similar program in terms of clandestine was started by Mao Zedong in 1948 in China in terms of playing some, as you called, chess games, although it was more toward the Eastern philosophy. And part of that was playing the United States government to take that friendly posture toward China that that our State Department did with Russia. And part of it is the fact that we have about 300,000 Chinese students, 90% of them in the United States annually studying the hard sciences. The computing, this is in addition to the millions of students in China studying the computer sciences. And as I listened to your explanation tonight, it reminded me of the 100-year marathon, particularly in the part of it's going faster than the 100 years as originally planned.
Oh, well, why didn't you say so? Yeah, I can answer that. There is a guy by the name of Mike Hayden, General Mike Hayden. He's the former director of the NSA, former director of CIA, and a 4-star retired Air Force general. And Mr. Piazza, about a year and a half ago, he told me, I asked him that very question, what's our concern when it comes to national security? He said, Russia thinks that it's a resurgent power, but in reality, it's a revanchist power. So the bottom line is, Russia's not as big and bad as it thinks it is. So while we have to keep an eye on what Russia's doing and watch Russia, he said what we really need to get right is China. He said because the reclamation projects that it's conducting out in the Pacific, the money that it's dumping into its Navy and its military, the fact that all over this country there is evidence that not only are they dispatching more and more people to engage in espionage. In fact, there was a big development today in Washington where the U.S. government is going to take China to task for hacking and espionage activities. But we're learning that they're doing it in more and more unorthodox ways, at least ways that we are not familiar with, which suggest they're looking at the long game. And they have been for a while. This is what General Hayden was saying. They've been at this for decades. When we look back at some of the things that they were doing back, as you say, in the era of Mao Zedong, and after, they're well ahead of what the Russians were doing. They were doing differently things that the Russians were doing. And what we're learning right now, specifically, about what the Chinese are engaged in, as I mentioned to you in one of those little scene setters that frame the time we live in, companies like Huawei, the executive that was essentially arrested in Vancouver. In 2006, Joel Brenner, who was the former NCIX, the National Counterintelligence Executive at the time, he warned me about another Chinese company that was making products, and he said, we know that they're installing backdoors in these computer projects, these computers that they're selling to the US. The long game is alive. The Chinese are experts at it. The Chinese government, we have no quarrel with the Chinese people. The Chinese government are experts at it, and there's a really big concern, I can guarantee you, from the FBI right now about the fact that China's pulling out all the stops to get as many people, regardless of what kind of lifestyle they lead, whether they're businessmen, whether they're students, whether they're tourists. They're using everyone they can to get as much as they can out of the U.S. And what they're doing it for, I'm not quite sure. I know that it's not a good thing, but I'm just not sure. Someone said to me years ago it would be the digital equivalent of Pearl Harbor. It could be. I'm praying that it's not, but it could be. But I'm also hoping that somebody is going to ask me another question. You're welcome.
Hi, my name's Edward Vincent. I came in a little late, but first of all, my answer is no to your question. Okay. And the reason partly is this question. What are your thoughts about the political overhang or political control of the intelligence units that we do have in terms of influencing the direction of the gathering and influencing the utilization of that information. In terms of an example, the recent Khashoggi situation in which the FBI or CIA made a determination, there was a political response to that from the administration in terms of whitewashing it or denying it and so forth. So if you're getting the idea of what my question is how much do we have to be concerned about in terms of politicizing intelligence agencies versus allowing them to function, optimally in terms of what their stated mission is?
Well, thank you for the question. I think we've all heard about the fact that the intelligence community is an independent, should be independent, as well as the Justice Department should be independent of any kind of political bias. But we've also heard about something called this alleged deep state thing, which kind of confuses the narrative. But I can tell you what I've learned from the people that I've been talking to for 15 years, and that is there is a dedicated cadre of intelligence, law enforcement, and military folks who recognize and understand that their overarching objective, which is the protection of this nation from threats, foreign and domestic, far outstrips any political considerations. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that I've heard from them that they operate independent of political considerations, regardless of what the people who are the mouthpieces for them say. In other words, put it to you this way, for those of you familiar with the federal government, it's been often said that the people that really run government are the GS9s.
A lot of those are great.
The bottom, what I'm saying to you is people whose livelihoods depend on the oath that they take to protect this nation are doing that work. And what we hear from some of the people that are more public figures regarding the intelligence and other agencies, it needs to be taken in that and viewed in that construct, that they are the public faces and public voices, but they are not necessarily the voice of the people that are actually engaged in the work behind the scenes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So you mentioned a lot of things today. What keeps you up late at night?
Well, thank you for your question, Ms. Luckett. It's really my genetics. My father was an insomniac. And, but no, honestly, I don't think I'll ever be able to visit Russia. I've never been there, but I think I've missed my chance. And it's because of the work that I've been doing. That was supposed to be a joke, but this is the thing that bothers me, though, that I have to think that way. A guy who lives not very far from me was shot in his driveway on March 1st, 2007. He was a friend of Alexander Litvinenko, and he had just been on NBC Dateline 4 days earlier blaming Vladimir Putin for the killing of Alexander Litvinenko. 4 days later, he's shot in his driveway. The police said it was a botched robbery. Well, who waits in the rain to rob somebody? And when you do get your chance, why don't you take his wallet? Why don't you take his money his keys, his car, which happened to be a Chrysler 300 and one of the most popular cars of the era. They didn't take anything. And there were two of them. He took one of them to the ground, and when he took him to the ground, he told the other one told his accomplice, shoot him. And they shot him in the stomach, and then they came at him again to shoot him in the head, and the gun jammed. So he's alive today because of that. So that case has never been solved. He is convinced that they were sent by the Kremlin. Nobody else is, but he is. That kind of thing keeps me up at night. Not just because his house is about three and a half miles from mine, but that kind of thing happening in America. So, yes, ma'am.
One of the things you haven't mentioned, I don't know if it's true or not, but I assume that the U.S. has its own operations, cyber attack, similar to the thing that we did with Iran and its nuclear capabilities.
Stuxnet.
And I was just wondering if negotiations go on with the country's relative abilities to create havoc, and if those negotiations could lead to some increased security.
Before you leave, let me just get a little bit of clarity. Negotiations with who?
Meaning that I assume that we have capabilities and are doing similar things to forward our own ends in Russia and in China.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know that for a fact, but I assume that we are. And similar to the way we handle spies, we tolerate some, they kick some out, we kick some out. I'm wondering if there are negotiations around cyber attacks or cyber capabilities.
What's your name?
Oh, my name is Marsha
Marsha, thank you for your question. I get the impression that there are. And here's why. John Cipher, who retired from the CIA 2014, worked 30 plus years. A lot of the time that he spent was in Russia House. He was a covert operative inside of Russia. And he said to me, Russia has 175 to 225 physical human spies in the U.S. now. The U.S., he says, has far less. And so when 60 Russian diplomats/spies were kicked out because of the sanctions after the 2016 meddling situation, he feared that they would kick out a commensurate number of Americans from Russia. That would essentially probably wipe out any representation that the spy service, the U.S. spy service, had there. I don't know if that happened, suggesting to me that there maybe has been some kind of discussions, negotiations, recognition that, you know, we got to keep this thing going somehow. But I don't think the Russians are necessarily interested in being equal when it comes to that. I think they're looking for an advantage. Based on what I've learned, there's nobody better in the world at running operations like the Iran, the Stuxnet thing, and running the same kind of cyber operations against other countries in the world. There's nobody, I've been told, better at that kind of thing than the U.S. So Edward Snowden, when he did what he did in 2013, and if you ever look at any of that material, it's very clear. Vault 7 will tell you things like that, WikiLeaks. You know, the U.S. has great capability. I'll put it to you this way to answer your question, and that'll be it. In 1998, or the late 90s, we had something in this country called the SR-71 Blackbird. Is anybody familiar with that? Yeah. The CIA had its own version called the A-12. I've seen the A-12 and, man, what, it can fly from New York to Los Angeles in 58 minutes. So the U.S. military decided to put that airplane in mothballs. So the one question I had was, if they're going to put something that good in mothballs? What must they have that we don't know about? And that's how I would answer your question. What we don't know about, if we knew, none of us would probably get any sleep. Seriously.
My name is Maria Constant, and my question is, and it's prompted by your story about the mic planted at Foggy Bottom in the chair. Our Secretary of State, who used her personal computer for official business, how did not security know about that? And secondly, in your view, how much, if any, damage did that cause?
Marcia, thank you for your question. I can't say for sure, but I can say what I've been told and what I've heard from what I would consider reputable sources, and that is we may never know the damage that resulted from that. One particular source who I would say is connected very, very deeply to the intelligence community in that regard has said, U.S. adversaries, everything that was discovered from her server or information that was compromised, every hostile intelligence agency on the planet has it. So I hope that answers your question.
It does, but it doesn't make me very comfortable.
Sorry. So thank you.
Mr. Green, thank you very much for being here. We've got a very small token of our appreciation, a set of pens from President Ford signed, so you can begin signing some things with President Ford's signature. Appreciate it. Just a couple other, how about another round of applause, please? So I know that I'm not going to sleep well tonight. So again, thank you very much for showing up. As normal, we have our information that you can please sign outside. Please sign up for our newsletter, our information for upcoming events. Sign up for Friends of Ford. If you're not already a member, again, joining Friends of Ford gets you a lot of benefits. For example, getting into the museum for free and seeing all the wonderful things we have, in addition to receiving the newsletters for something just like what's happening tonight, so you don't miss our future lectures. Please join us for cookies and coffee in the lobby. Thank you very much. Have a great holiday and New Year.